Well, good morning. It's Richard Pears from FinextraTV. Today I'm joined by Helen Avery. She's Director of Nature Programmes and GFI Hive at the Green Finance Institute. Helen leads the nature team at the GFI, overseeing the Institute's initiatives to mobilise private sector capital into nature-based solutions and nature restoration. So, hello, how are you? I got that out.
Well done. I'm great. How are you doing?
Yeah, very well, very well. I'm really excited to have you guys join us today because everybody I've been talking to has been talking about this report. So it's long, so we're going to try and sort of share it with a few people. You're talking about the materiality of nature-related risks to the UK financial sector, both near-term and long-term. And everybody I talk to says, well, it's all great, but we don't know how to price the risk of nature. You're coming a long way to addressing that. But first of all, tell us who the Green Finance Institute are, and how do you do what you do, and how does it help the financial sector?
Yeah, well, thanks for having us on, Richard. The Green Finance Institute was set up in 2019. We were seeded actually by the UK government and City of London Corporation to work with government and the private sector and civil society to mobilise private capital to help the UK meet its net zero and more recently nature targets. So that kind of financing green of the greening finance and financing green side that we often talk about. So effectively a not-for-profit. In the last 2 years, we have actually expanded internationally as well with philanthropic funding. So we work across things like the decarbonisation of road transport, energy efficiency of the built environment, sustainable aviation fuels, and as you mentioned, I head up our nature efforts. And then in the nature team, our focus is really on this transition of the global economy to one that values and invests in the natural environment, which is, a long-term vision. And then our mission is to increase the role of private sector capital in paying for and investing in nature restoration and nature positive outcomes. So one way we do that is we support the development of nature markets in the UK and revenue models. And then we also work on that longer transition that I mentioned through supporting the disclosure of nature-related financial disclosures and risks with the TNFD.
Okay, wonderful, beautifully put. So you've released the report, came out a couple of weeks ago. Why have you released this? And tell us some of the sort of key findings.
Yeah, so essentially, when we started this journey into nature a few years ago, there was so much great work that's happened around the world, but also in the UK around sort of developing supply of project, pipeline of project. We often hear in nature finance, we used to hear there's no pipeline, but now there is a real big pipeline of projects. And we also, at the same time, a couple of years ago, we were working on the UK National Consultation Group for the TNFD. And in both of these instances, we just found there was very little interest from companies. Financial sector was interested for various reasons. They wanted to know what their risk is, but they also were looking for opportunities to lend and upfront finance and invest. But companies are in that middle where they're either buying in the nature markets, they're buying ecosystem services and credits, for example, or they're thinking about investing in their supply chain and moving towards a nature friendly or positive trajectory. And we just found that there was no business case for them to move. So one idea we had was, okay, how can we evidence that nature really is a material risk? Will that get companies to move? So that's essentially why we started this piece of work. So we brought together an amazing technical team of University of Oxford, University of Reading, WCMC, National Institute of Economic and Social Research. I want to mention them all because I feel like they deserve the credit for the analysis.
Yeah, for sure.
And it was with the aim of understanding, as I said, sort of what is that material risk for the real economy, and then where possible, could we even understand what the risk might be for financial stability, and therefore something that our central bank and the financial sector needs to address. So in terms of key takeaways, obviously the biggest takeaway is the fact that biodiversity loss and environmental degradation do create demonstrably material impacts for UK economy and the financial sector. And in fact, so the technical team developed a series of scenarios to test. There were 3 scenarios, and they showed that the deterioration of the natural environment in the UK and around the world could slow economic growth by sort of leading to, GDP to be lower by 6% than it otherwise would have been by the 2030s, and actually 12% lower under an AMR pandemic scenario. So just to put that into context, that's more than the 6% is higher than the impact of the global financial crisis on UK GDP, and the 12% is higher than the pandemic, the COVID scenario, on GDP. So I think those were the main takeaways. There were many in that we can get into, but that was the key.
Yeah, I mean, they were pretty dramatic headlines, and also you touched on the methodology there. Of course, we've spoken to the Institute of Actuaries and their Emperor's climate new scenarios and etc. And you referenced, obviously you were creating scenarios for central banks in mind, and all of these aspects of integrated assessment models and so forth. So you really, I think, looked at what's happened in the climate world, brought it into what you were doing, and then also you've addressed some of the criticisms to take on board, tail risks and so on and so forth. So that was really good to see. And I think you did a nature-related risk inventory, risk-based analysis, and a scenario-based analysis approach. Is that right?
Yeah. So University of Reading developed the first ever for the UK. It's a nature risk inventory. So it's 29 of the biggest risks to the economy. So no surprise that when it comes to highest impact and highest likelihood of occurrence, what we're seeing there was soil health decline, MR, zoonotic disease, and then global supply chain repercussions. Those were the highest risks. And then there was this nature-related value at risk piece that looked at sectoral risk, and we can talk about that if you want to go into more detail. And those kind of fed back into each other and then helped develop these three scenarios. It was a domestic scenario, an international supply chain scenario, and then the AMR pandemic scenario.
Yeah, and there's some great charts in there which bring all of that to life, I think, for people. So when you get into the industries, the ones that were most exposed, I think manufacturing, services, and agriculture. Is that right? Can you expand on the sectoral piece?
Yeah, sure. So as you might expect, agriculture is obviously the sector with the highest risk as a proportion of economic output due to, water shortages, soil health decline, pests, and also climate, the regulation of climate. But it's actually quite a small percentage of the UK economy. So in terms of value of assets at risk, the actual sectors with the greatest financial risk are the services sector, which is obviously our main sector in the UK, and the manufacturing sector. And you can sort of imagine that those two sectors have exposure to so many different ecosystem services. And obviously this piece of research went beyond just showing what their exposure was, but actually what the material risk would be from that. So that's why you get such high figures in manufacturing services. And I think that's quite a surprise to people. Some of the biggest risks, again, was due to ground and surface water shortages, also the ability of sort of nature's role in regulating climate. And then the third one, which I think is super interesting, but very bizarrely worded, is called mediation of sensory impacts.
Oh, yeah, I saw that. What does that mean?
Yeah. So it's essentially the role nature plays in keeping us physically and mentally healthy. So it can be, when we degrade nature, we have air pollution, which obviously affects our health. There's many studies that show how mental health improves when you spend time in nature, but actually not many studies that show what the negative impacts are on mental health when we're removed from nature. But we do know that connection. So that was quite high for manufacturing and services, mainly due to labour shortages and people having to have time off work.
Yes, and I suppose people out in agriculture working in isolation is always a big thing, isn't it?
Well, that's a big thing too, yeah. But less to do with nature, I suppose, and more just lack of people around. And
yeah, that's true. So now the report's been released. So we've got this. Let's just recap what we've got. We've got a process which is drawing on a lot of great evidence and academic. We've can see what the impact to GDP might be. There's a measurement, nature-based value at risk, and we can see the sectors that are exposed, and you've highlighted that, which ecosystem services they're drawing on. So we're talking to a fintech, data, finance audience. So now this has been released, what are you sort of expecting that the financial services industry and corporates might do as a result of looking at this and understanding the work you've done?
So I think specifically with the finance sector, there's always a lot of interest. There always has been. They're the biggest movers in TNFD, for example. And as I say, they've always been interested in how they can sort of play a role in whether it's making loans or investing in nature restoration, or companies investing in their own reducing impact on nature and investing in the supply chains. So we've actually had a lot of positive feedback from them, and for them it's going to be about that assessing and managing those nature-related financial risks, which is going to mean they're going to have to put pressure on companies in whom they're invested or lending to make those changes. So I think that's key for them. Also, there's a bit of a gap because they need their own scenarios. Like the scenarios that were developed are really at a macro level.
Yeah.
So now it's about sort of understanding how these scenarios would work for the financial sector, and some of the technical team are looking at working with banks, specifically in the UK to start with, on how they might start adapting those. So I think that's the financial sector, I think, has quite a lot of support. It would have much more support if our central bank actually was more vocal about how it's going to be looking at nature in addition to climate, and sort of seeing where maybe some of the risks have fallen through the cracks by not in looking at nature, because we show very clearly in the analysis that chronic nature risk is as detrimental as chronic climate risk. I think that's very clear. So if you're not looking at nature, you're actually missing out quite a big part of our risk. So that's for the financial sector, and there's a lot of data and analytics that need to be built in to help them do that. And actually, even the estimates that are in their report are very, very conservative, just because the lack of data that we were able to get to. So there's a big piece there to be played, as we know, with some of the the nature-related disclosures. For companies, I think we need to see transition plans, because I think companies have been slower to come to TNFD, if I'm allowed to say that, we host the TNFD. So, and I think it's because they're not under any pressure at all, really, and also they can't make the business case to their boards. Obviously we hoped with this report that they would have more of a business case as people working in companies who are really trying hard, and this sort of arms them with some evidence to go and take it to the board. But what we hear is that unless it's easy for them to see how they're going to transition, so without those sort of nature positive pathways by sector or those transition plans, it's quite hard for them to just say, okay, we'll disclose our risk, but now what? So I think that's really where we need to be going next, is these transition plans, these sectoral nature positive pathways. And there is some movement and discussion around how that might come to fruition. And then it's on us to pressure companies, and it's on financial institutions to work with their companies.
Yeah, I mean, and I hear that a lot, and there's obviously greenwashing, but green hushing, that phrase, which is, I don't want to tell anybody because, if I put myself in front of the pack, I'm likely to be attacked. But I think what you're seeing with lots of, you talk about litigation risk in the paper as well, don't you? There's lots of NGOs, people like Client Earth, etc., are now prosecuting using geospatial data, satellite data, etc., to show what corporates are doing to nature. And I my sort of view is, unless they get a grip on it themselves, they're going to have it done to them, if you will. So they better get a grip on it and start to do the mitigation to avoid the worst of that. Would you have a sense of that?
Yeah, I totally agree. One of the things I've been thinking about is, papers, the analysis like we've just done, it comes at a cost. It was funded, and we're very, very grateful to funders, but you want it to have the impact at the end. So, it's out in the ether now, and obviously, as we led the project, my concern is, well, what if nothing changes? What do we do? And so I've been really sort of trying to understand, how did we get to where we are with climate? How did that get moved? And when some of the things I read, I mean, there were a million things that happened all at once around sort of the Paris Agreement. But one point was that Unilever and IKEA led. And I just think we're lacking that in nature at the moment. As you say, litigation is going to increase, transition risk is going to increase, but I very rarely see companies coming out and saying, we're going for it. And, you mentioned green hushing earlier. There is this, I wonder if that's almost a bit of an excuse that some companies hide behind of, we don't want to go out in front of the pack because, might end up with some bad press. But someone has to lead, and that's just really what we're lacking for the whole nature agenda at the moment. So yeah, that would be, we need a leader.
Indeed. Well, we're certainly going to find that, and I'm delighted you guys are going to be involved in sustainablefinance.live in October. We're going to focus on this paper, I think, and we're going to try and bring it to life in the sort of the day in the life of a trade, from the field to the trade, and how do people get the data, and how do they price it, and how do they measure and manage it. So more to come on that, but you've given us, if you like, the empirical data that's going to make that a really fascinating event. And of course, the financial institution, they got to focus, I think you say in the paper, between 8 and 53% of the portfolios of the 7 largest banks in the UK are exposed to this nature-related transition risk. So, as you said, they need to be interested, yeah?
Yeah, and a part of the analysis looked at what we ran the scenarios on their domestic portfolios. That was the only data we could get, and it showed that there's quite a sizable impact, a negative impact on portfolios when you take into account this risk. One thing I didn't emphasize was that this is now onwards. We deliberately sort of planned it. The analysis from the chronic risk started in 2023, and then the acute risk, the shocks, happen in the 2030s, but it could happen now. So the urgency is really high, especially as you say, regarding the transition risk.
Yeah, well, we're hearing it every day on the news, aren't we, with the weather-related side at the moment. So what's next after the paper? I know you sort of hint that there are more technical, more information to go. What's on your agenda heading up for the next few months?
Yeah, so I think we want to do a lot more engagement. I think it's, whenever you do these pieces of analysis, it's about who you get in front of and how does it land, and how do you work with boards to make them understand this, and also really thinking about the opportunity side. That's what we hear a lot is, yes, okay, about the risk, but what we really want to hear is about the opportunity, because that makes boards light up. So it's how do we start a narrative that moves from risk into opportunity based on the analysis we have. As mentioned, some of the technical team are now looking at how they can work with the financial sector on scenarios development. We're pushing through, we're sort of pushing forward on this need for transition plans, as I mentioned, hopefully working closely with the central bank to see, understand better how we might support them in incorporating some of this evidence into their current understanding of climate risk as a start. That would be really key. Also, the technical team actually did the GDP analysis on many countries. It wasn't just the UK. The UK was the most robust because that's what we were focusing on. So hopefully, if funding comes along, then there'll be the chance to actually deliver these GDP results for sort of up to 50 countries, actually, which I think would be really helpful, especially this year when we've got COP16.
Yeah.
So onwards and upwards, really.
Yeah, that's going to be really important, and there'll be people on here that want to follow you up. So let's give them the website. We'll put it obviously on the Meet the Material, but it's how can people find you if they want to follow up, Helen?
Yeah, it's thegreenfinanceinstitute.co.uk, and all the other nature work is GFI Hive. You can find us on LinkedIn, obviously Helen Avery, but also Dr. Nicola Ranger at the Environmental Change Institute, who is obviously going to be speaking at your event, was the brains behind a lot of this analysis, and you can find her on LinkedIn, or just reach out to us and we'll connect you.
Wonderful. Well, listen, thanks so much for sharing that, for all your great work, and look forward to working with you as we go through the year.
Likewise. Thanks, Richard.